So Hojo-san is headed out of the country tomorrow. So for the moment, you have me. We're giving Hojo-san a little bit of a rest, a well-deserved rest before he heads off for Japan. So you may recall that when I'm sitting in this seat and giving a talk, I've been talking about something called the 108 Gates of Dharma Illumination, which is included in the 12 Haskell version of the Shobogenzo. It's mostly a long quote, which was picked up kind of wholesale and set down in this text. It's a quote from another text called the Sutra of the Collected Past Deeds of the Buddha. So of the 108 gates, today we're on gate number 9. We kind of have a long way to go. There's lots to talk about here. So gate number 9 says, mindfulness of Dharma is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it reflection of the Dharma is pure. So you might remember last time I was talking, we'd gotten to gate number 8, which is mindfulness of Buddha. Now we have mindfulness of Dharma, next time it'll be mindfulness of Sangha. So we've now moved into a section of this text where we're talking about the 3 treasures, right? So, mindfulness of Dharma is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it reflection of the Dharma is pure. This is pretty much the same structure as the line about the Buddha, which was mindfulness of Buddha is a gate of Dharma illumination, because it was something like reflection of Buddha is pure. So, I think we need to consider first what Dharma is. We probably all know what Dharma is, but we need to consider what Dharma is, and then what it means to actually be mindful of Dharma, or to bear in mind Dharma, or to remember Dharma, right? So, as we saw last time in the section on Buddha, there are 3 kinds of 3 treasures, or 3 meanings of the 3 treasures. Last time we talked about 3 meanings of Buddha. So today, of course, we need to talk about some meanings of Dharma. Next week, 3 meanings of Sangha. So we'll get through this section on the 3 treasures. So the root of this Sanskrit word, Dharma, has a meaning like something that is established, or something that's firm. And there's a bit of a connotation of something that supports something, or like bears something up, right? So there's this kind of feeling of solidity. Not in a way that doesn't move, but just something which feels to me reliable. This is my own, right? This is my own response to this thing. So Dharma as a term, of course, predates the Buddha in India. In Hinduism, Dharma is like the religious or moral law that governs individual conduct. So there's a real element there of like social responsibility. When I was teaching Eastern religion in the classroom, I had to make the distinction for students. You know, you start out with the Dharma in Hinduism and you move into Buddhism and it changes. And it's something a little bit different. So in Hinduism, this Dharma, there's a broad Dharma that applies to everybody. And it includes virtues like truthfulness, not harming other people, generosity, that kind of thing. There's also a very specific Dharma to be followed according to your particular position, your class, your caste, your socioeconomic status, your station in life, and all of that. So in Buddhism, of course, Dharma is something different than that. And we sometimes encounter dharmas, plural, right? Which really indicates all the interconnected elements of this phenomenal world. So sometimes we'll hear things like the myriad dharmas are doing this or that, right? It's all the elements of this phenomenal world. So these 2 aspects, for us there are 2 other important meanings of Dharma. One, of course, is the Buddha's teachings. So what the Buddha awakened to under the Bodhi tree, and what he taught for the rest of his life and career is Dharma. But also Dharma, of course, is simply the reality of all beings, right? So there's something more concrete and there's something more abstract or absolute. So these 2 aspects of Dharma make up the Buddha's Dharma body, what we call the Dharmakaya, or the Buddha's Dharma body. So it means that the Buddha is really still here and still practicing and still functioning, even though his physical body lived and died 2,500 years ago. But because of his Dharmakaya, Buddha is still here. So it's another indication about how we can't really pull apart 3 treasures, right? They arise together, they function together. So for our purposes of Dharma study, we can indicate Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, but really it's almost impossible to separate them. So this kind of Dharmakaya, this kind of Dharma which is about this larger picture, is the Dharma as one of the absolute 3 treasures, right? So this is Dharma that has no boundary. It can't be separated from the other treasures or from anything else. So the Dharma, of course, existed before Shakyamuni. Before Shakyamuni woke up, Dharma was already there. So like he didn't invent it, right? It was there before him. So he didn't create it, but he's not separate from it. So the historical manifestation, or the real-world manifestation of the Dharma, as we say, is the teachings of Shakyamuni. What he saw and what he helped his followers to understand. So this is the Dharma as one of the manifesting three treasures. So we have the absolute, we have the manifesting. And then there's the Dharma that we encounter written in sutras. Right? We can pick up a chant book, or we can pick up a sutra book, and we can actually encounter something in this life. And this is the Dharma as one of the maintaining three treasures. Right? So we have the manifesting, the maintaining, and the absolute. So three kinds of Dharma. Right? So manifesting three treasures, the Dharma as Shakyamuni's teachings. The maintaining three treasures is the Dharma that's written down and we can encounter in a book. The absolute three treasures is the Dharma that can't be separated from anything else, which is this true reality of all beings. Right?
I have a picky question.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the word Dharma is capitalized, and other times it's not. So could you?
Well, I think there are conventions about that for publications. So I think sometimes when we're thinking about Dharma in the absolute way, it's a capital D.
Oh, okay.
But I wouldn't get terribly hung up on that.
Thank you.
In our minds, in my mind, I don't capitalize it. I don't know. It's, but that's my own convention. So if you have taken precepts here or attended a precept ceremony like we just had last week, people received the precepts. Maybe you've been to a monthly Ryakufussatsu ceremony that we do here. If you've been to any of those things, you've heard Hojo-san read the Kyoju Kaimon, right? Which is Dogen's instructions on the precepts. And because we take refuge in the three treasures as part of that whole practice, Dogen has something to say about three treasures. So in the Kyoju Kaimon, he says the reality to which the Buddha awakened is the Dharma treasure. That's the manifesting version. He says the truth that expresses itself in the form of the Buddha's teachings, stored in the ocean treasury and recorded in the scriptures on the Patara leaves in order to transform animate and inanimate beings, is the Dharma treasure. That's the maintaining. That's the written down kind, right? Because in the beginning, that Dharma was written down on leaves that were formed into books. The reality that is pure and free from defilements is the Dharma treasure. That's the absolute version. So let's say a couple things about each of these kinds of Dharma. So we know in the Buddha's life story, after 6 years of doing some fairly ascetic practice, as the Buddha, as Shakyamuni is looking for what is suffering about, what do we do about it? He does about 6 years of various ascetic practices. He travels around from teacher to teacher. He can't quite get it, an answer that's satisfying to him. He sits down under the Bodhi tree finally and has an awakening experience at the age of 35. And then he wonders, now what? What do I do now? Because I've awakened to something which I know is really important, but it's so profound and it's so different than the way we kind of normally think. There aren't going to be very many people who can understand this, right? So like, what do I do with it? He has to think about that. It's difficult. This Dharma is difficult for anybody else to understand. And then he realizes, well, somewhere there are going to be at least a few people with enough who are not so completely deluded that they can't get this on some level. So he decides, I do need to share this. I do need to teach this because there's somebody somewhere who's going to get it. So I shouldn't keep this to myself. So he goes out to share this Dharma with others who can benefit from that. He goes and finds the 5 monks that he's been practicing with previously, doing some of these ascetic practices, thinking that they might be the ones who can understand this Dharma that he wants to teach. Of course, they don't welcome him back into the fold, right? Because they know he's given up all of these ascetic practices. He's realized that the middle way is the way, so to really mortify the body is not helpful in that way. So he's eaten some food. He's probably had a little bit of rest. Now he's had this awakening experience. So they think he's taking it easy, right? He's not You know, he's kind of left the fold, and he's kind of, it's a cop-out, right? So they don't want to like welcome him back in. But as he approaches, they see he's got some kind of calmness, he's got some kind of equanimity and some kind of stability, and they decide, after all, maybe they will listen to what he has to say. So he begins to tell them about Four Noble Truths, right, about the Eightfold Path, these really central things to which he's awakened. So he starts to, what we would call, turn the wheel of the Dharma. This is the first turning the wheel. So this turning of the wheel is the first manifestation of the Dharma as Buddha's teaching, because he's now sharing what he's awakened to with other beings. So this wheel is turning. So this eight-spoke wheel has come to represent the Dharma in our tradition because it is about this continuous spreading of teachings to help people wake up. So this wheel is turning and spreading the Dharma to help all beings manifest awakening. So, of course, we still see that eight-spoke wheel today. We see it certainly in sort of really old Buddhist settings. It's carved into stone buildings, and we see it on all kinds of things. Sometimes if you're looking at iconography of Buddha, you'll see wheels on like hands and feet, palms and soles of the feet. But even today, for instance, if you look at the insignia of the Buddhist chaplain in the military, it's an eight-spoke wheel. So this wheel is still around. And this wheel is still somehow turning. So it's an important symbol for us. So Shakyamuni teaches these 5 ascetic monks, and from that time on goes on to expound various kinds of teachings, basic teachings that we still have today, laws of causality, dependent origination, everything arises from something. So there's causes and conditions, and based on those causes and conditions, things arise. He certainly taught about impermanence. The causes and conditions are changing all the time, so what's arising is changing all the time, right? There's nothing we can grab onto. Something is here, but it's not going to remain here forever. It's not going to remain in this state forever. If causes and conditions are changing, it can't help but be that the things that arise are also changing. So that impermanence, of course, by extension, means there is no fixed and permanent self. There's no self we can grasp, because the self is changing all the time, because our causes and conditions are changing all the time. So all of these really things now we think are really basic core teachings, he starts to expound. And of course he spends the rest of his life traveling and teaching and spreading the Dharma and sharing with other people how to practice and how to manifest awakening. And that's the manifesting Dharma treasure. So that's how it originally manifested in this world. So sutras and sutra books are the maintaining Dharma treasure, again, something we can physically encounter today in our lives, in our practice. So we know that Buddha's teachings were not written down during his lifetime. They were really collected after he died. Before that, it was an oral transmission, so from Buddha to somebody, and somebody to somebody, and somebody to somebody, right? And so these things were handed down by speaking, and they weren't written down until sometime after he had died. So after he died, his disciples gathered together in a council, and they said, we really need to go through all the things we think we've heard, and all the ways that we understand what the Buddha said, and make sure that everything is in agreement, because you heard this, and you heard this, and you heard this, right? So we need to get together and make the corrections and get everything organized, verify with each other what we've actually heard, and sort of correct this oral record, because they were concerned that maybe things were being inadvertently changed, or something was happening to the teachings. So a number of disciples participated in this council, collecting these records and putting these records together. So today, of course, we still have sutras. We still have recordings of the teachings. For us in this particular tradition, we focus on texts like the Malakirti Sutra, the Lotus Sutra. We're familiar with the Heart Sutra, which we'll do after this for our World Peace Ceremony, from the Prajnaparamita literature. So we can read these things in books that we can pick up and we can hold. Or in this day and age, we can hear recordings, right, of teachings. We can go online. So we have access to teachings in a number of ways. We can continue to encounter what Buddha said today as the maintaining Dharma treasure. So, if these things are Dharma, what does it mean, this mindfulness of Dharma? now we need to sort of switch to that. So mindfulness of Dharma is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it reflection of the Dharma is pure. What is that about? So mindfulness in our tradition is about something which is remembered, or something that we bear in mind. So it's not about focusing on one thing to the exclusion of everything else, right? So in our popular culture, we hear lots of uses for mindfulness, lots of mindfulness exercises, mindfulness in various forms and in various containers. So for us, it's really about bearing something in mind. In its broadest form, it's about simply not forgetting to practice. It's simply remembering to practice. So in this case, Dharma, bearing the Dharma in mind, is not forgetting what the Dharma really is, or perhaps what Dharmas really are. Right? We have to not forget what the Dharma really is. So mindfulness of Dharma, or mindfulness of Dharmas, means we have to pay attention to our relationship with the phenomenal world. So if our relationship with the phenomenal world is clear, and it's not muddy and it's not clouded, right, then the reflection of the Dharma is pure, because we're not introducing something else. If we create a gap between ourselves and all beings, and then we toss in all kinds of misperception and delusion into that gap, then that reflection gets distorted, right? It's not a clear reflection or a pure reflection of Dharma. So on the one hand, of course, if Dharma is the true reality of all beings, or the way the universe works is another way to think about that, then whatever, the universe is doing what the universe does. Dharma is working and turning and doing whatever it does, regardless of what we think about it. So it's really beyond our ability to create a gap and throw stuff in. In the big picture, that's true. So it's in that way, it's not actually possible for us to reflect Dharma in an impure way, because we're part of this universe that's working, and so we are part of that reality. Whatever is happening here, diluted or not, is still part of that reality, right? So in that way, it's not actually possible to reflect Dharma in an impure way. And yet, even beyond our limited, sort of position as a human being. On the other hand, of course, it's good to reflect Dharma in a way that moves us, and all beings toward wholesomeness, and away from unwholesomeness, right? We would want to walk through the world that way. We would want to participate in this vast working in that way. So if we're not paying attention to our relationship to this world and the way the world actually works, we're acting based on our idea about how things are, our concepts about this working, this big working. So then we're taking action based on stuff we've made up, right? Rather than the true reality of all beings. And that's where we can get into trouble. So, that's really kind of a recipe for creating suffering, perpetuating suffering, because we're not acting in alignment with reality. So what we're reflecting is not in alignment with reality. What we're going through the world and sort of creating and spreading is, I think of it kind of as dissonance, right? There's just this little bit of something doesn't line up. So it makes it a little bit uncomfortable. So not long ago, Risa, one of our Sangha members here, introduced me to the idea of aspirational recycling. And maybe she's also told you about this. Aspirational recycling. She read an article about this. And I just thought, this is such a great metaphor for our practice in our life. So she said, it's when you really, really want something to be recyclable. It's not. But you really think it ought to be recyclable, so you put it in the bin. Because somehow that's going to change reality. Right? It's like, I really, really want this, this thing to be recyclable, so I'm going to put it in the bin. So, what do we think is going to happen to that object? It's not going to change its chemical composition because we want it to be recyclable, right? So it doesn't matter how much I wish for that, it can't be. And yet I aspire somehow for this thing to be recyclable. So, is that going to work? No. Somebody at the recycling facility is going to have to find that thing and pull it out of the waste stream and, redirect it, do something else with it. But I think it's really a great metaphor, right, for our lives, because we so much want things to be a certain way, and we're going to act as though that's true. And somehow we think that's going to make it true. which is not to say we shouldn't have aspiration to make change in our lives if that's what needs to happen. But there's some intention around that. We're going to do something to make a change. Whereas if I simply want to say, I want this to be something else, so I'm going to pretend that's the way it is. Aspirational recycling. So putting a non-recyclable object in a recycling bin is really not mindfulness of Dharma, right? We're not really paying attention to this phenomenal world. Our relationship is based on something which is not reality. So, it's action that has no relationship to what's truly happening in front of us. It's action based on something we wish was true. So that's not to say fake it till you make it isn't sometimes a good strategy. But we got to fake it till we make it with some intention, right? Not just because we hope something magic is going to happen. So if I wish the good things in my life will never change, I cling to them. Even though impermanence says it's not possible, everything's going to change, Somehow that's a bit in my mind like aspirational recycling. If I wish this or that pretty thing was mine, so I help myself to it, was not given to me, I'm just going to help myself to it, even though I'm breaking a precept. This precept about stealing, kind of like aspirational recycling. So, to reflect the Dharma in a pure way is to really, in my mind, to be in alignment with reality, to be acting and moving through the world in a way which is clean, clear, true, upright, straightforward, not creating dissonance. So I think suffering, when we think about suffering, I think that's about disintegration, right? We're not integrated with what's really happening for a lot of reasons. Sometimes we don't see what's really happening. Sometimes we sort of choose not to see what's really happening. And something comes apart. There's some disintegration. We're living in our own world that we've created, kind of out of our own stuff. So instead we need to see that we've never actually been separate. It might seem that we are, but we've actually never been separate, and work toward reintegrating ourselves. In here, reintegrating, and also reintegrating ourselves with this phenomenal world and sort of paying attention to our relationship there. So, when I was running the Milwaukee Zen Center, this is an example, I think, about how we do this in our Zazen. When I was running the Milwaukee Zen Center, in the summertime I would leave all the windows open on the ground floor, which is where the Zendo was, because it was hot. And without fail, first Zazen period of the evening, 3 bells would ring, and the shrieking would start from next door. And it was, the parents had come home from work and they were playing with their kids outside, which is terrific. But we're all sitting there in Zazen, and this shrieking is happening. And part of my brain is saying, well, I'm really annoyed by this noise. I know full well that I should just be letting sound come in and sound go out, but somehow I'm really annoyed by this noise. And the other half of my brain is saying, but isn't it great this family is playing together, and the parents are taking time with the kids, and it's a joyful noise if you want to think about it that way. But somehow I would spend the whole period wishing those kids would go inside and be quiet. I just couldn't wait for them to go inside and be quiet. So at the same time, I'm genuinely thinking this is a good thing. So I'm kind of holding these two things, right? The important activity there was not what was taking place next door in the front yard. The important activity there was what was happening in here, right? Because the experiencing of that sensory input about my phenomenal world is here. So to put the responsibility for it out there somewhere is a delusion. Now maybe I can go next door and say, please be quiet, but beside the point, right? What's really going on is, here I am sitting Zazen, should be like a swinging door, right? Things going in, things going out. I shouldn't be grabbing, shouldn't be doing anything with that, poking my head in, and yet I'm receiving some kind of input about my phenomenal world, and look what I'm doing with it, right? So I had the opportunity, because this happened every night, I had the opportunity to say, here it is again. And to watch my personal reaction to my relationship with this phenomenal world. And to watch my own perceptions of what was happening, my own response. I could see both positive and negative feelings coming up. I could watch myself write a story about it. Here it is again. This happens every night. Maybe I should close the windows. I wonder if everyone else is bothered like I am. How much longer is this going to go on? Right? We all do this, right? This should be kind of familiar. So if I'm paying attention to my relationship with the workings of this phenomenal world, then that means I get to try to respond skillfully rather than falling into habituated thinking. So in our Zazen, we can open up that little bit of space. We can have that little bit of a gap that says, wait a minute. What's actually happening? Is what's going on what I would like to have going on in my relationship here, or should I choose to do something else? Gives us that little bit of a space to take a breath and say, wait a minute, and to make a choice. So rather than getting angry or getting impatient, my Zazen is being disrupted. So, what is my Zazen? There's delusion number one. We'll get precious about our Zazen. We should have silence. It should be perfect. So rather than doing that and being disturbed, maybe I have the opportunity to see that this sound is just sound. Here's another one of the myriad dharmas. It's a sound that maybe we call children shrieking. Right? Rather than radiating some kind of suffering based on my delusion and getting caught up in my own stuff, maybe I can have some equanimity. Because the reality is there's no real cause for getting upset. It's just sound. And in our Zazen, we smell incense, we feel our clothes, we hear sound, right? All kinds of sensory input about this phenomenal world is coming in. So we don't cut off our relationship with the phenomenal world when we sit down and face the wall. We can't maybe see what's going on here. But somehow our senses are still working, right? This is our human condition. We don't shut off the body. We're letting the whole catastrophe in. So when we have all that input coming in, what are we doing with it? And our Zazen gives us a real chance to practice with all those myriad dharmas and to sort of clarify our relationship with them and clean up that relationship a little bit. One of the most helpful things I ever read in a Dharma book was actually shortly after I started to practice, and the paraphrase is something like, the original nature of everything is tranquility. And that blew my mind. Those are really turning words for me. The original nature of everything is, this thing is perfectly tranquil sitting out here. If there's upset around it, it's happening here, right? It's not because that object or that Dharma is doing something to me. It's because I'm perceiving it in a particular way and I'm creating a lot of stuff. So this thing is perfectly tranquil. I can't blame this thing for my mind state. Right? That sound in its original nature is completely tranquil. I can't blame it for my mind state in Zazen. Right? That relationship is clean until I muddy it up. So disturbance happens when we poke our heads in. Right? And we add stuff into that relationship that maybe doesn't need to be there. So to reflect the Dharma in a pure way is to let that come and go and be in alignment with reality. If we have a response, our responsibility is not to ignore that response because that's not separate from all of this great big reality. But are we going to feed that? Are we going to spill it onto other people? Are we going to carry it into the next day? Or can we pay some attention to what that relationship looks like? Mindfulness of Dharma is a gate of Dharma illumination, for with it reflection of the Dharma is pure. So when it comes to mindfulness of Dharma, our effort is not to forget what Buddha taught, of course. Dharma study is important in our practice for that reason. So we can come at this mindfulness of Dharma through Zazen and through our daily lives and the way we move through the world. And of course, for us here at Sanshin, we do a fair amount of Dharma study. It's an important part of our practice. So yesterday, during our one-day retreat, we spent some time talking about Dharma study, which to me is a really interesting conversation because, at least in the West, I don't hear a lot of discussion about Dharma study as a practice. There's a lot of talk about what should I read and all of this and that, but what's the role of Dharma study in our practice? All we seem to hear about is, well, we shouldn't get too caught up in our books, right? that our practice is about more than book learning. But for us here at Sanshin, Zazen, work and study are the three real core aspects of our Dharma life here. This is what we do. Do Zazen, do work, and study things. So probably you've encountered this argument or this teaching somewhere that says that because Zen or Dharma are beyond words and letters, that studying is no use, or that we should somehow ignore written teachings, or that we don't actually need to have any kind of intellectual study of the Dharma. So is Dharma beyond words and letters? Absolutely. Do we frequently, usually live in that place and really understand that and practice with the Dharma in that way? Probably not, right? We all came into this practice probably needing some religious education because we weren't born, most of us were not born into a Buddhist culture. So we come to this practice and we have to learn everything there is. We don't get it by osmosis from our culture the way we might if we were born in a sort of predominantly Buddhist culture. So there has to be some learning, right? We wouldn't be sitting here if somebody hadn't taught us how to sit and taught us what the Four Noble Truths were about and shared with us some basic teachings. So to study is an important part of our practice for several reasons. To read a teaching from someone like the Buddha or someone like our teacher gives us an opportunity to sort of share their experience of the Dharma. So if I read something that's written by somebody who's somewhere ahead of me on this path, I have the opportunity to get in that person's head a little bit, to get into that person's experience a little bit. This person has probably experienced things that I haven't. And we get to sort of share that space for a little while, which is really helpful. It's really a pointer. It opens up some opportunities and some aspiration, I think, for us. Because not only will we learn something from that, it's also inspiring. Here's somebody on the path a little bit ahead of us who's been practicing for a while, seems to be standing up straight. We can do the same thing. Because, of course, one of the most important things about what Buddha taught was, I woke up, so can you, in essence, right? Because this is not, a few elite people somehow have an awakening experience and, that's it. All sentient beings without exception are the Buddha nature. So here we are, folks, a bunch of Buddhas in this room already. We all can do this. So to share somebody's experience who's a senior to us on this path is important and it's helpful. And we can do that through study. So we need to approach whatever text we're reading with an open mind, with some flexibility, because we may be challenged by the Dharma we read. Somebody teaching us the Dharma might be challenging us. And we don't have to agree with whoever the author is, whoever the teacher is, but we do have to look at our reaction and say, where is that reaction actually coming from? Because sometimes what's going on is, here's the Dharma, I'm reading and studying this Dharma, and it's causing me to think, if this teaching is true, I have to change something, and change is scary. If this teaching is true, I might have to change how I see the world. I might have to change what I think this self is. I might have to give up some habit that I know it's not good for me, but gosh, it's comfortable because it's familiar. Right? So we need to be free from fixed views when we're coming to the Dharma. Dharma teaching is interesting that way. Dharma study is interesting that way because it could point out where we're stuck. It's the part that we're really uncomfortable with, right? That's the part we need to pay some attention to because it shows us where we're stuck. There's some teaching here I need to spend some time with because it makes me nervous, which is all right. So Dharma study is traditionally one of the ways in which we cultivate wisdom, and there are some steps to that, or some phases, or some elements of that, as we talked about yesterday. We see and hear the Dharma. We take it in somehow, right? We encounter some new teaching, or maybe some teaching we'll re-encounter. These things come back around. We take it in and we start to think about it, and we do some reflection. And then something happens. we start to digest this Dharma in a particular way. We start to integrate this Dharma or these teachings in a particular way. And somehow we're reflecting Dharma in a pure way. So it goes beyond intellectual exercise. And it goes to how are we living? How is this Dharma manifesting in my day-to-day, moment-by-moment existence? And Dharma study is important for that. So we need to learn the basics of this tradition, like what the Four Noble Truths are about, and what the Eightfold Path is about, and the Three Marks of Existence, and all that stuff. Partly because that's the foundation to continue to study, and partly because we really need to integrate those things into our lives as a basis, as a foundation for how we build our relationship with the phenomenal world, how we interact with other people, how we see what's going on. These things have to really become a part of us. So the initial kind of Dharma study might be an intellectual investigation of teachings by reading a book or hearing a talk or something like that. But we don't stop there because we have to figure out what does this Dharma mean for me in my life? What does it have to say to me about my day-to-day experience here in this modern 21st century West? One of the things that was really important to Uchiyama Roshi was how do we find the meaning in Zazen and in our practice in this modern day-to-day world? So we can read a book that was written centuries ago, but what does it mean today? What does it mean for this one, right? We need to practice with those things and figure it out. So we can move from concepts. Originally we have concepts, what we think the Dharma is, what we think the Buddha is about. We move from that to expressing the Dharma in our own lives, in our own particular ways, based on our particular causes and conditions, and whatever we were endowed with as individuals, whatever particular skills and talents we have. Somehow we manifest the Dharma in our own ways. So we start to get what it means in this non-intellectual way, and when that happens, Dharma really becomes real for us. It's not something out there, right? Now it's right here. So this is sometimes not so easy, right? Because impermanence is scary. If we're going to really integrate teachings about impermanence, we've got to let go of this need for something which is fixed. Because impermanence can be good when it's something I have in my life that I don't want is going to move on. Impermanence is great because I'm not going to be stuck with this thing, whatever it is, forever and ever. But impermanence can be scary because it's also about loss. It can be about death. It can be about separation. This is scary, scary stuff. So it really takes some intention and some courage and some diligence to study Dharma, to practice with Dharma, and to really integrate these things into our lives, because we can get this on an intellectual level, but then someone close to us dies, and now it's real, right? Now it's like right there. So we have to completely digest this Dharma, or else it's just some ideas somewhere here. So Zazen is one of the ways that we do that. We just sit down, and I sort of think about it as I'm just going to sit down and inhabit myself. Right? I'm just going to inhabit this body and mind and not have to do anything else about that. So we have some direct experience of how this reality works. We watch this going on, right? We watch this reality of all beings happening right here. So this isn't Dharma that we memorize from a book. This is Dharma that we just find ourselves right in the middle of. We put ourselves right in the middle of it, right? Because we intend to sit down and do something. We have some commitment to practice. We're going to sit down right in the middle of this Dharma, this phenomenal world that's doing what the phenomenal world does. And we're just going to settle into it and see what happens. It's like the most immediate kind of Dharma study, right? So we need the intellectual structure, we need the conceptual understanding to lay the groundwork for our practice, otherwise we're kind of wandering around a bit, right? It can be difficult to keep sitting if we don't have some balance with some kind of Dharma study. But of course, if we only have the book learning without the actual practice, then we really cannot fully digest these teachings, because that's where that kind of happens. That's where that percolating kind of happens. So when we've completely taken in and digested this Dharma, then we can start to function smoothly as part of this larger, greater world of all beings, true reality of all beings. And we stop being the bottleneck, right? We stop being the element that gums up the works, because we're in complete alignment with Dharma. So we're still ourselves. We still have all the personality that we ever had. Sometimes folks think when they come to practice, well, what this means is I have to stop being me somehow. I have to merge in with everything, and that means that I don't have any personality. And that's not what's happening here. That wouldn't be healthy, would it? Because our causes and conditions have given us certain gifts and certain experiences, and we need to use that for the benefit of all beings and use that in our practice. So it doesn't mean we give that up. But somehow, still, we're seamless with everything that's happening around. So in this one unified reality of all beings, there's a seamlessness there. Right? So there's difference, but there's also unity. So we're able to fit in a balanced, seamless way and reflect that Dharma in a very pure way, right? So what would you like to say about reflecting Dharma in a pure way, or whatever is on your mind that's bubbling this morning? Please.
To me, reflecting Dharma sounds kind of metaphorical. As though here I am, here's the Dharma out here, and it's hitting me, and I reflect it back out. And so I'm a little confused by that phrase, reflecting the Dharma. What you were talking about near the end with, and this is my paraphrase of many things that you said, being mindful of the Dharma and then manifesting the Dharma. That was a word that you used in that part of your talk. Is that what you understand by the phrase reflecting the Dharma?
That might be,
means manifesting the Dharma?
It might be, manifesting might be a better word. This text says reflecting, and so I'm working with that as a word, but manifesting might be a better word. But when you say that, it reminds me of Indra's net too, right? So we have all these little interconnected dharmas that are reflecting each other, and yet they're not separate. So that reflection is happening sort of in the midst of this idea that, well, there's something here and it's bouncing back out, right? So there's this interconnectedness happening between these little nodes of you and me and all beings. And in that way there's some reflection, but there's actually not a separation that would make that happen, right? So it's like several things are going on at the same time. But I understand why that feels like a separation for you. If you don't like the term, use manifesting.
Well, reflection is a very beautiful and poetic and also practical idea. I mean, we know what that is because of looking in the mirror.
Sure.
But I think it just needed a little translation there. So yes, thank you.
And another way to think about that, I guess, is a reflection. We don't generate a reflection by ourselves. If we're reflecting something else, again, we're responding to our environment. We're responding to what's around us. So again, we are behaving in accordance with everything else, all the other causes and conditions that are happening. And in that way, it is a bit of a reflection, if we can think about it that way too. So I think there's a lot of ways to get at it. English, what can you do?
Thank you.
Sure, who else? Please.
I can't remember exactly the story, but I remember having read there was some encounter between a disciple and his teacher, and the essence of it was that the disciple said, "How do I get in touch? How do I get in harmony or in accord with the Dharma?" And the teacher said, "If you try to get in harmony with it, you go astray." Are you familiar with the story? Could you say a little more about that?
That kind of teaching happens in various places, so that story is one good illustration of it. So one way to think about that might be if we're trying to be in accord with something, then we have some idea about what we're trying to be in accord with. And as soon as we do that, we can't get 100% there. We can approach it, but we still have to give up that idea about what am I trying to be in accord with. So it's kind of ironic, isn't it, that we want to make some effort toward being in accord with something, and yet we have to also make effort not to have an idea about what we're doing. But this is the paradox that happens in our practice over and over, right? We're aiming to hit the mark, but at the same time, if we try too hard, we go past it. You know, not hold that too tightly is important. And we run into that metaphor a lot too, right?
Is it sort of like maybe the idea of some middle way between effort and letting go?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Because we certainly have to make effort in our practice. I mean, otherwise we wouldn't practice. So it takes some effort at 5 o'clock in the morning to be here, as you so frequently are, sitting on a cushion. You know, that takes some commitment. And we need some commitment in our practice. And we need diligence and all of those things that we hear about. But we also can't, what's the word I want? We can't hold too tightly to an outcome. And if the outcome we're holding to is, I'm going to be in alignment with something, and that thing is changing all the time, we also have to change all the time. So it's this series of constant micro-adjustments, just like our Zazen is a series of constant micro-adjustments. So, you know, if we're too fixed on something and it's moved out of the way, guess what? We're going to go past it, right? So we have to maintain this panoramic awareness of dharmas to know what to do next, right? But it's not something we hold in our minds and say, you know, here's this panoramic world of the dharmas, and somehow I'm going to fit it in here, because we can't do it. We can't put boundaries around it. We have to just be in the middle of it, you know? Bird flying in the air and fish swimming in the water. We just have to be in the middle of it and aim as best we can, but know moment by moment by moment, things are going to change. And if we're not careful, we shoot past it. So we've got to be like aware all the time. So maintaining awareness of dharma or dharmas, I think, is not unrelated to what you're talking about. What do you think?
I think that's a good clarification.
Other things to add? Who else? Were you jumping in?
I was just going to say, I've heard the story before, and it's like somebody saying, I want you to be spontaneous.
Mm.
You can't, or I want you to fall in love. You can't do it. You just have to get yourself out of the way so it can happen on its own. Because once you start to force it, it never works.
Right. Well, and we know there's nothing we ever want to force in our practice. Zazen is not about forcing anything. Practice is not about forcing anything. As soon as we're forcing something, we have an idea, right? We've got some fixed idea. This is the only right way. I struggled with that for years. That's my personal experience coming out. I struggled with that for a long time. Who else has something to say? Nate?
Yeah, I think so. When I come here, when I practice, I sit and I get to listen to Oda-san talk, or I get to listen to you talk, and I'm in this space. It's easier for me to sit and reflect the Dharma, and which is, you know, what we're creating the space to do that. So, kind of like we talked about yesterday, is when I go out into the world and things become polarized again, you know, and it's very difficult to navigate. And of course, I try to come back daily, we try to come back to the cushion, we use work, we use study. I guess I see, you know, you and I see Hoji-san or people who are much further down the path than I am. I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about growth and navigation in the world.
Growth and navigation in the world. I think the longer we practice, it may be that we are quicker to notice when we've drifted. Because it's so easy to fall into habituated thinking and not even realize we've done it. So again, sitting Zazen opens up that little bitty space that maybe gives us the opportunity to say, oh, wait a minute, what am I doing? I can feel something in my body, there's some tension, something's arising, I don't know. So of course it's a little easier to do that when we're sitting still, facing a wall, right? Because we're not distracted by things. Although we all know the wall can become the movie screen, we throw all kinds of stuff on the wall, but we're not feeding that kind of distraction. Then we get out in the world, and my goodness. You know, we can barely remember our names some days, let alone how can I remember the Dharma. But I think the sooner we begin to notice we're drifting is the sooner we can come back. And that in itself is still important practice, So I think we can't hold an idea that, well, I will never drift, and that's the ultimate ideal goal, because we're human beings, we're always going to drift. But the sooner we notice it, the sooner we come back to that space, because you've created, you're talking about creating a space. So yes, here we've created a particular kind of container. It encourages a particular kind of practice. So our challenge is, how do we create a container out there? How do we carry that container so we're not leaving all of our practice here? How can we go out into the world and still have some kind of a practice container? I know for myself, after I've sat, a fairly intense sesshin, I can feel that I still have the container for a little while, even when I've left. Of course, it dissipates. It's like, I want to keep it, and it's gone. But I can even feel, maybe half a day sometimes. I'm just like still in that container, right? So how can we, and I don't have an answer for you, because each of us has to do this. I can't do it for you. We can't do it for each other. How do we create a container that we can take out into the world that keeps us mindful of Dharma? There are certainly things we can build into our day to bring us back. Like before I answer my phone, whenever it rings, I'm going to take a breath. Okay, I can come back. I'm sure I've shared with you one practitioner mentioned to me many years ago, one of his practices was as he was driving to see the taillights ahead of him and say, those are the eyes of Buddha. Oh, I'm back. So there are things we can kind of build into the day that remind us, oh yeah, wait a minute, don't forget to practice. And those can be lots of things. But certainly, Dogen Zenji had instructions for how we do everything from cooking meals to brushing our teeth to using the bathroom, because it was all practice. So there are little gathas, little 4-line poems, if you're in a training temple, that are posted on things and that you do before you shave your head, or while you're shaving your head, or while you're brushing your teeth, right? These little things you recite to yourself that happen throughout the day. And these are very common, everyday activities we need to do to take care of our lives, and yet in that moment, if we have a gatha for that, it's practice. So there are some sort of traditional classic gathas, but there's nothing that says you can't write your own. And people do, because in this modern Western life, we're doing things that nobody used to do 100 years ago or more. Maybe you write yourself a gatha for something that happens for you every day, frequently, like answering the phone, or getting in your car, or whatever. Post it somewhere, right? Here it is again. This is a practice. This isn't just me taking out the trash. Here it is again, right? I mean, that's one example, things we can do just throughout the day to say, every time I go up and down a flight of stairs, I'm simply going to walk and breathe, or something. Find something in your life that brings you back. So in that moment of polarization, which is the real challenge, right? You turn on the news and, oh my gosh, what's happened today? Can you take a breath? Feel what's happening in your body. Hear the habituated thinking. Here he goes again, or here she goes again, or here's that thing again, right? Okay, what am I actually doing with that? Am I writing a story about it? Am I labeling it? Am I judging these thoughts? Is it good or bad for this one? Or am I able to look at it clearly and say, do I need to take action? Do I not need to take action? What is the skillful action here? Sometimes the skillful action is not to do anything. Depends. So I don't know if that helps you. But I think that's one of the real challenges of our practice about how do we take zazen off the cushion, to find those places in the day where we can remind ourselves, come back, come back, come back. Dharma's still here. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think going back to what you said originally, I think if you think of that diagram that Uchiyama has about going off the zazen line, in a sense, maybe what's happening is that for some people, if you're at a beginning stage, maybe our drifting goes on for a long time before we drop back.
Yeah.
But over time, maybe it's a shorter time.
Yeah.
In a sense, you realize a little bit sooner than you would earlier.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. Because it's so easy to fall into our old habits, right? And not even realize we've done it. So practice gives us that opportunity. Is this really what I want to do here, or do I want to do something else? Does that help at all? Any follow-up there?
Maturity. So
when you are with someone who's been practicing a long time and they have a certain level of practice maturity, it's really something. Because boy, they're there. And I'm guessing they drift because they're humans, but they don't drift for long. and you just get this sense of solidity and depth, and it's like, wow, they're here. And they're not here in a way which is, I'm seeing this and I'm not seeing the rest of it. It's like they're seeing the whole catastrophe. It's pretty amazing, which is why Sangha is important. And practicing with others is important, because we encourage each other in that way. And we provide examples for each other in that way. So sometimes you kind of feel like you're being pulled along in somebody's wake, It's like you're just grateful they're there, because we're all contributing our spirit when we're sitting in the Zendo. We're all contributing. So we were talking yesterday about how, the Zazen of a person who's just learned to sit is not essentially different from a Zazen of someone who's been sitting a long time. And somehow we all come together and we make that container. It's really important. Mark, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'd like to also comment make a comment with Nate that one of the things I found in my practice is that I'm an angry driver. I readily admit that.
What a great opportunity for practice.
Yeah, it is. And one of the things I've noticed is that the time between me yelling at the person in front of me, or behind me, or beside me, and the distance and the time between me laughing at myself is directly proportional to my practice.
Mm-hmm.
And the interesting thing I have found as I have sat and as I continue to sit is that angry driver doesn't go away. He just becomes impermanent. And that is the most bizarre thing I have found about the practice, is that at the exact same time I am denying myself and affirming myself in a universal way that just I can't figure out.
Well, you're doing some reintegration there, right? Because my guess is at some point you were either unaware that you were an angry driver, or you may have been unwilling to really closely look at the fact that you were an angry driver. I'm guessing, I don't know. So your ability to feel that coming up and to say, wait a minute, what's happening here? And to let go of it to the point where you can laugh at yourself is a great practice, isn't it? I mean, doesn't it feel great when we see these things about ourselves and we go, oh, geez. And we can have a little compassion for ourselves and kind of laugh with ourselves, not like at ourselves, but kind of laugh with ourselves, give ourselves a little bit of space. Yeah, I think that's a good example of noticing what's happening and being able to not get on the train with it, right? First we have to notice. Job one is show up. And when we're suffering, notice that we're suffering and see what's happening around that suffering so we're not spilling it over. So just maintaining mindfulness of those things is a critical part of the practice. Other comments, questions? Iris?
I don't know if I can say this right, but so last weekend with Precepts Retreat, so yesterday you were talking about when we reread texts and then you have different times in your practice you hear different things, and Precepts Retreat I really like because it feels so practical. It's it's getting going, and then it's just precepts. And Hojo-san was talking about not for the first time trying, or I don't know, but getting rid of our self-centered, I'm saying it wrong because I'm thinking of something else, but our self-centered views, like he's talked about many times, but hearing it somehow in the context of this thing that I think of as a very practical, precepts. I don't know, it really resonated with me. And then yesterday in that retreat, doing so many different work, practice, study, all in one day, this mishmash, and having so many opportunities of dropping off body and mind in different contexts, and while moving, and while sitting, and while eating, and all the different things. It was such a really interesting opportunity for me, and I think that there was just some clarity I had about with the dropping off body and mind, and just, I don't know how to say it, but just, whatever. And then the difference, going into the world, quote unquote, which we're always in the world, but where maybe delusion runs amok a little more prevalently. I feel like it just was a lot in my body, a lot clearer about that's the self-centeredness, and like, oh, in the same way that I don't know if this is the right word, but like that I don't know how to say, like rely on, like it's like my perspective, or I don't know how to say it, is, dropping off body and mind, and then suddenly everything comes from that, and then when I walk away from, when I walk away from practice for a second, I'm all distracted. It's like I've put self-centeredness in the exact same position. You know what I'm talking about?
I think so.
And so then it's like, but suddenly I'm relying on, as if this is, this is why I don't usually talk. But
Dharma's
it's like,
beyond words and
suddenly
words.
it's like, as I'm pretending like I'm living from practice.
Yeah.
Except, oh yeah, it's all my self-centered. And I'm like, oh, I don't really want to do that. Ooh, I don't really,
Yeah.
I'm in a bad mood. I want to get to do this. And does that
Absolutely. Yep. No, I understand. So,
It makes a lot of sense to me.
so I think this is related to what we were saying earlier about when our practice challenges us. If we read something that we find challenging or something like that, we can know full well that what we're reading is true, helpful, wholesome, and yet it can be hard to give up our self-centeredness because it feels darn good sometimes, right? Because to drop that away can be a bit scary. So although we can convince ourselves we're living from a place of practice, there's probably always a little bit of self-centeredness in there. But that's the human condition, and it doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to practice. It doesn't mean that because we find that self-centeredness, somehow our practice isn't worthwhile, or it isn't good, or something like that, right? So I think it's pretty easy to forget and to put self-centeredness back in the middle as opposed to a larger perspective, which is why we keep getting on the cushion. That's why we keep coming back, right? There's no, I do it once, I get it forever, right? We have to keep at it. We have to keep coming back. So yeah, it's a real challenge to figure out how do I walk through the world from a base of practice and a base of awakening. And even when the self-centeredness arises, to catch it and see through it and see it for what it is and be able to let go of it. Because even when we see what's going on, sometimes we don't want to let go of it. As you say, I'm angry today. I want to feed my small angry child. So I don't want to let go of that, So it's a challenge. First we have to see what's happening, and then that's not always enough for us to be able to let go. So we have to keep going. Other comments, questions, things for today? Please.
Early on, you brought up the image of the wheel, and I've always been kind of curious about the connotations of that. I mean, does it have to do with the idea of moving? I would imagine in those early times, the wheel was quite a technological innovation because it allowed transportation or moving. Is there some notion about movement? I mean, what are the?
I think so.
symbolism?
I think so. Well, and I don't know for sure, so I'm just going to tell you what I think because I haven't looked it up. But to me, it always feels like it could just be a static wheel, and okay, that's a symbol of something. But the fact that it's something that turns and that there's some movement there feels important. Like there's some change happening. There's some energy there. There's something is moving. Because, of course, everything is moving, right? Everything is changing all the time. So it's not like here's a fixed and static teaching and here it is forever and ever, amen, right? I mean, there's the activity of actually sharing the Dharma, but I think there's also the dynamic working of the Dharma itself and the universe
Maybe it's
itself.
related to the loom that is often referred
Yeah,
to in
could be.
Buddhism.
It could be. So, I mean, here's this thing that's turning. Did you want to jump in?
I thought it was related to dukkha, because dukkha means an axle that's off center.
Oh, that could be.
It means a wobbly wheel,
Mhm.
like that can cause you discomfort.
Mm-hmm. My guess is that depending on your tradition, there are multiple ways to kind of look at that, and I think as long as it's in whatever way it's meaningful for us is not wrong, right? So, yeah, it feels to me like there are several kinds of movement happening, and that it's not just a fixed, like, flat circle, you know? But somebody who knows more about the history of that than I can
It kind
certainly.
of relates also to impermanence, that things
Yeah.
are constantly changing.
I think so. I think for me that's a helpful way to practice with that symbol. I think the whole axle thing is important too, because if it's off kilter, it doesn't work well. And there may well be some really interesting history around that, which now I'd like to go look up. Because of course we could do a whole talk about that, right? But the dynamism of that feels important to me somehow. And of course it's continuous. It's not a linear, right? So it's a wheel that's turning because it's circular, because it's not like we get from here to here and we're done, right? It's just this constant turning. So to me it's the teaching, but it's also just how the universe works. Other things to say? Or have we had enough for today? Okay. Thank you, everybody.